Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elise Labott, columnist for Foreign Policy.
داخلين عرس.
تفضل.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this important panel on investing in equality. As we imagine our collective future in the post-COVID environment, we're mindful that structural inequalities between rich and poor and developed and emerging economies have only grown wider. Governments acted to support individuals, companies, and communities and industries ravaged by the pandemic through economic stimulus and extensions of public services, but those support systems are running out, and leaders from public and private sectors must take bold action against the social and economic consequences of extreme inequality. How can sustainable support structures scale towards systemic resilience in the face of ongoing crisis? And what effective private sector strategies with the public sector can be utilized across public lines? Joining me is a wide range of views and experience on this subject. His Excellency Abdou Cissé, Secretary General of the Presidency of Côte d'Ivoire. His Excellency Dr. Nabeel bin Mohamed Alamudi, the CEO of Olayan Financing Company. Khalid Al-Hussan, CEO of Tadawul, which owns the Saudi Stock Exchange. Norm Coleman, former senator and senior counsel at Hogan Lovells, Sharon Thorne, global board chair of Deloitte and Touche, and Margery Kraus, CEO and founder of APCO Worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us. Khalid, let's start with you. Structural inequalities between the rich and poor and developed and emerging economies, we know they're unsustainable. But let's talk about the urgency here, the threat of inequality to the future functioning of communities and societies.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon, and it's always great to be back physically. So a straight answer to your question, in my opinion, yes, it is urgent. And you know, inequality comes or takes many forms. Inequalities, gender inequality to financial inequality to inequalities of opportunities. And in whatever form, inequality usually poses a grave threat to individuals, societies, government, and as well as organizations. So I do think that business and government leaders have an obligations to ensure that we cooperate together to always combat inequality in whatever form or shape it presents itself. And if I look at COVID-19 pandemic, I think from that perspective, the inequality here have participated in how organizations look at it. And unfortunately, if organizations do not take the importance of equality within their operation and society, in my opinion, and I come from capital market perspective, in my opinion, these organizations will lose a meaningful benefits to their stakeholders and society. So if you look at capital market institutions, and I come from the Saudi Tadawul group, we always look at ways to enable growth for companies that are not only financials and beyond balance sheets. And I would look at this in perspective of two aspects. One, in enhancing sustainability and inclusiveness in the growth of capital market is an important element to fight and combat inequality, in my opinion. And an example of that is, look at how ESG is becoming from the perspective of capital markets. This is beyond balance sheet, and how issuers, how investors, how stock exchanges look at ESG is an important element. And I do believe strongly that it is a way of combating inequality. The second aspect I want to look at or speak about from a capital market perspective as well is financial literacy. It is extremely important because that always allow fighting or combating the inequality by raising awareness, raising the education and access fairly to everybody from a capital market perspective. And I will give an example on that. We are part of the World Federation of Exchanges, where most of exchanges around the world members of. And we have dedicated one day on the business calendar, which is Ring a Bell for Financial Literacy. It's just to continue to be ready and be proactive to combat inequality from that perspective. From the group perspective, we created several programs, including what we call Invest Wisely. This is a very essential element, in our opinion, or in my opinion, to fight and enhance equality versus inequality.
Sharon, why don't you pick up on that? Deloitte and Touche, manages to advise companies, governments. I mean, you're looking at equality in terms of not just the bottom line, but also setting up policies. Talk to us a little bit about the kind of urgent threat we have and how you are advising your clients.
So this is it's a fantastic conversation, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it. It is extremely urgent. If you think just in terms of that threat, that civilizations ascend when the majority of people believe that the economic and social system benefits them. But the opposite is also true, that if people think that the system no longer works in their favor, then civilizations can crumble. And if you also think about the connectivity of the world now, and the fact that billions of people know what's happening and can share their thoughts in seconds, then we have real potential risk, and we're very aware that poverty and inequality is greater than it was, and we're much more aware of it. And there have been a number of movements that have sought to tackle inequality over the last few years. We had the Arab Spring here in the Middle East. We had the global Me Too movement. We have Black Lives Matter in the US. Then we have the increasing inequalities caused by COVID that you've referred to, by climate change. All of these things are adding hundreds of millions more people into poverty and are likely to continue to increase that unless we act. And Deloitte is doing an enormous amount ourselves. It's something I think I'll talk about a little bit later. But we're also, businesses have to address inequalities, and we have to, Deloitte is working with governments, with NGOs, with multilateral organizations to help them think about their strategy and how these things can be addressed, and then helping them implement those strategies. We have to drive system change. We have to ensure that people have access to the resources to enable them to be resilient, to contribute and to thrive, and that can, those access to resources are education, healthcare, working opportunities, affordable housing, affordable energy, and it's awful that we are not able, we're not doing that at the moment. So this is a golden window of opportunity for all of us to come together to drive systemic change and to say that, we will ensure that people have much greater access, everyone has access to these things, to enable them to be successful, to remove these inequalities. So we have to seize the opportunity.
Well, we have a lot of strong views on this subject at this panel, and Norm, I'm going to...
I have a different somewhat, let me just say. First, I do believe that every child should have the opportunity to be the very best they can be. That's the goal for everybody. And so, things like racism and sexism, you have to deal with that. But I get troubled by the focus on economic inequality. I don't believe that there's a correlation between how many rich people you have and how many poor people you have. And that, at least, and I bring an American perspective to that. So the greatest voices who are talking about economic inequality are talking about redistribution of wealth. They're talking about Bernie Sanders, ultimately talking about socialism. And socialism is a failed expression. Churchill once said in socialism, it's a failed philosophy, it's a creed built on envy, and its only inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. So I don't think socialism, you talk to the Venezuelans, the Cubans, not the response. The greatest tool to bring people out of poverty has been capitalism. We have brought, in 1990, 36% of the world's population was living under less than $2 a day. Today we're about 9.2% of that. 800 million of those folks are in China, which has a higher economic index today than it's had. And so I would hope the question would be, how do we rethink capitalism so that we have a more impactful distribution of resources to lift people out of poverty? How do we do that? I think that's the challenge of government and the challenge of business, is how do we make that available to kind of lift greater number of people out of poverty?
So Nabeel, let me ask you, I mean, look, I think, it's an open question of whether countries that have put economic equality at the center of the debates have generated greater prosperity. Let's talk about what policy solutions are required from national governments. What shape should new policy frameworks take, and how do they differ throughout different markets?
Well, first, welcome back to Riyadh, and it's great to have everyone here for the 5th FII in person, have this great panel. We've been known to export energy through our oil barrels, and I think now we're exporting human energy through the positivity of the last week in Riyadh. I think we can all agree for that. And thank you for everyone who's been organizing this for the time being. I think Senator Norm has started off a very interesting discussion. Maybe the only way I take it is, let's not think of an inequality of economic prosperity, but inequality of access. And I think of it in two main frames where we need to be conscious of it as a society, as a government, as a private sector. Inequality of access to education, inequality of access to healthcare, and I believe Sharon mentioned that as well. If we can get that equality of access, and now with the way that things are going in terms of technology, you can do a lot more digitization and so forth, and in both fields, and we're seeing tremendous changes in that in those two fields. I think you can begin to have that belief in that everyone has a chance at economic prosperity. But without early childhood education early on, a parent usually has to stay home with a child. That kind of a role needs to be fundamentally looked at, and across all societies. And different countries have managed that differently. I think on healthcare, I mean, in a positive way, you saw a very, very fruitful collaboration between the vaccine providers and the government to try to accelerate the development and the distribution of vaccines in less than 12 months. So we should be careful about that, but we should also say, when we have the will, the political will, and we certainly have the brain power and the economic might of the private sector, a lot can be done. So let's try to focus on that on the education and continue to do that on the healthcare moving forward while we move out of this crisis.
And Abdu, we've talked about access as being one of the main impediments to equality.
Yeah, but thanks again. It's a pleasure being on this panel. I'm not a socialist. I'm a capitalist. But still, I think that we need to know and we need to acknowledge, and the COVID actually showed us that the world is really interconnected. No one can be left behind. When I say no one, it's both individuals, but also countries. So we need to work together. Something that also we need to acknowledge is that poverty is one of the main causes of terrorism and migration. So I agree with all that has been said regarding what we need to do in terms of education, particularly for girls, in terms of health. With COVID, we also noticed that we need in every country to have a minimum universal health coverage. If you don't have a minimum of universal health coverage, basically part of the population is going to be left behind. So we really need to focus on that. But there is one part also that we need to acknowledge, which is important, is job creation. People lost jobs during COVID. And the big question now is, how do we rebuild job creation? We already had issues. If you take Africa, for example, every year you have 12 million young people that come to the market. How are we going to find jobs for them? That's why I agree with digitalization. I think it's something that is really powerful that we need to look into. It's ways to create new opportunities for young Africans. But we need to go beyond that. We need to build infrastructure. If you look at data showed us that countries where you have investment in public infrastructure, countries where you have a labor market which is really developed, are the countries where inequality is really reduced. That's the case, for example, of Europe. If you compare to Latin America or other parts of the world, inequalities is lower in Europe compared to other parts of the world. The question is, how do you finance it? I've been on both sides of the table. I've been on the private sector, now I'm on the public sector. It's really not easy to find ways to finance the development of our countries. So I will be able to elaborate on that later.
Okay, and Margery, we talk about equality and equity, but people then they also throw in and women and girls. But I think a lot of this, and that's what you're doing at APCO, is really paying attention to how women are adding to the society, and that needs to be brought in the offset.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to remember that I think COVID was a wake-up call, and I would say it's a chance for maybe a line in the sand. And I think, unfortunately, women were 22% at greater risk during COVID to lose their jobs, and over 50 million women lost their jobs. And statistics show that maybe 90% of them won't come back in the workforce. And if we're ever going to have equality, we have to find new ways to engage the women and give them an opportunity along with the men. And it shouldn't take 135 years to get to that that place of equality, which is what the World Economic Forum is saying it's going to take. So I agree. I mean, I'm the child of immigrants. I came to the United States. I built a business. I feel like, I believe in the system that Norm was talking about. But I do think that what we have seen is that over the years, the latter years, where the income distribution has gone, it's become greater between the rich and the poor, that we have to think about some way to have a more equitable distribution of wealth. It doesn't mean socialism. It might just mean that we rip up the playbook that we've had and try to think of better ways that government and business can partner together to create opportunities for everybody that creates more
Yeah, I mean,
equality.
Sharon, I'm tired of this kind of, there is not, a moral choice between, or a moral equivalency between socialism and capitalism, right? I mean, there are a million kind of models that you can fashion in between. Let's talk about how business leaders should treat the challenge of inequality. What new governance is required to create this equity that we're talking about? So
I think businesses and leaders have a key responsibility to help address, inequality. And there are lots of things that businesses are being looked to now. So lots of stakeholders, so employees. We do a millennial survey every year. Millennials want to work for companies that are purpose-led and values aligned to theirs. Regulators are saying we want to ensure that companies, that their purpose and values are more than just words. Consumers can vote with their feet. And then financial investors in financial institutions are challenging businesses to say, we want to see what your targets are around ESG commitments, and then we want to ensure that you're delivering on them. So businesses are being looked to, and driving equality is not just the right thing to do, it's the right business thing to do, because we can't be successful if we're living and working in communities and societies that are broken. So we have to help address it. So I think businesses have three key things I'd just reference. Firstly, they have to invest in the technology and services that are needed to help address underserved markets, and I think they're investing in new technologies, in new business models, and we're seeing that this is happening, that we are serving more and more of the population as cost to serve comes down. The second area is businesses have to address inequalities within our own place. So I think we've already referenced it, but workplaces have to be truly inclusive so that people are able to achieve their aspirations at the same time whilst truly being themselves. And at Deloitte, we're absolutely committed to empowering all of our people to achieve their potential, regardless of gender, race, disability, sexual orientation, but also socioeconomic background. And we've put in place a Bright Start program, an apprenticeship program, for example, that takes people from school and helps them develop the capabilities. we also, I think business is the third area, is that we should use our capabilities to make a difference and impact in society. And so, at Deloitte, we have hundreds of thousands of people who are very talented and want to give back. So we've set up a social impact initiative called World Class to empower 100,000 people by 2030 by giving them access to education, opportunities, skills development. So I do think businesses have a key role to play. Just on the governance piece, boards are really, really important because boards oversee, they set the tone from the top, but also they can ensure that a company has appropriate purpose that is committed to addressing inequality. And then they oversee and make sure that that their actions are being delivered in line with those, and also that they're reporting on it. And obviously, we've all heard about stakeholder capitalism. More and more companies are committing to stakeholder capitalism and setting a real purpose.
So Nabeel, taking a few things from what Sharon said. Number one, it's not, for businesses, it's not just about the bottom line, the dollar anymore, or the currency anymore, the returns on your investment, right? Businesses are responsible now to their customer in terms of ESG, in terms of social consciousness. And then it's more about, I think there's more of a recognition is it's not just about productivity, but about your people. And if you're investing in people, then you're going to invest in a company that is going to not only have a better product, more productivity, but make a greater contribution. So talk to us a little bit about, from a business perspective, how do business leaders treat these challenges?
Yeah, so the Olayan group was the first Saudi company to sign up to the World Economic Forum, the IBC's stakeholder capitalism metrics, which we just did a few months ago. And I think one of the learnings for me personally is, having been in the private sector and then went into the public sector, public sector then private sector, I said, okay, the public sector is quite complex. And I went to the private sector, it's pretty damn complex as well. I mean, you have all the ESG metrics, you have your employees, now you have your shareholders demanding a lot more from you. And just looking at the net income statement is not really what you're being measured against anymore. And that's maybe a new notion of capitalism. I don't think it's socialism. It's not socialism. Everyone still wants to have that currency at the end. But it's just, you have to look at a lot more complexity about and how you're treating your employees, what you're doing in society, what you invest in. And all of that just has made the role of the board, the role of the CEO, the role of the chairman a lot more complex. I've been privileged to be on a number of boards over my career. And in the last 2 to 3 years, ESG has been a topic of every one of them, and in some sectors that you would not have thought so. And that massive shift is actually quite interesting to watch and difficult to manage, if I could say so. I think just on jobs, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about ESG and we're talking about all the various things that happened post-COVID-19, but we forgot about robotics and AI and what that might do to job degradation. That's still a challenge within all of us.
And the whole idea of reskilling, right?
Right, that whole idea of reskilling as well. So all of these have made even a purely private sector player, it's just a lot more complex world. You can't just sit back and say, I'm just going to manage my balance sheet and that's okay. So.
And then you have to deal with government regulation.
Correct.
The government plays a big part, and I was a mayor before I was a senator, and as a mayor, and I had a city that was in decline when I first got elected, and we turned it around. But the pillars of rebuilding the city were, one, of course, the public sector and things that we had to do. But the other piece, it was a three-legged stool. It was the private sector and the nonprofit, the foundation. The nonprofit was based on money from the private sector. So 2/3 of my growth was based on a robust private sector. I was asked, Mayor, what are you doing for kids today? And my answer was, the best thing I can do for a kid today is make sure mom and dad has an opportunity for a job. Because conversation on the breakfast table is different when mom and dad are going to work rather than they're just getting a handout. And so it is a challenge. And by the way, I'm thrilled. Business really is rallying, and it's wonderful. It's a magnificent thing. But there's a responsibility on government to create an environment which business can operate.
Well, I mean, that's true. And Khalid,
before we leave the business side, I just wanted to say there are practical things too that I think play on this. And that is, if you want more equality in the workforce, there has to be more flexibility. Childcare has to be addressed. There has to be flexible work hours because especially on the women, they're caregivers as well, more than the men usually. And all these things feed into the equality and the equality of the opportunity. And
Well,
I
that's
think
what, in the
we're
United
trying-
States, we're talking about this kind of infrastructure plan.
Right.
And does an infrastructure include these kind of, attention to childcare, attention to those things that help families thrive as they're trying to work? And Khalid, I go back to the United States, I think it's different in Saudi Arabia because the government is so attuned and so, part of its very mission is to take care of its citizens, from cradle to grave, really. But in the United States, I think for COVID, what was really interesting to me is, the government fell short in a lot of ways. And if it wasn't that the private sector kind of came in and really helped out and helped get some of this stuff moving and working together, really, competitors really coming together in a way that we really, I think, Sharon, haven't seen. I think it's a whole new way of a public-private partnership taking place.
It is, but let me comment on the previous question is, in my opinion, it's how do you look at the challenge? If you continue to look at inequality as a challenge, in my opinion, you will still react to solving problem. But I think if you look at it as an opportunity to add more to your business, and I'm looking at it from a business perspective, if you look at it from an opportunity point of view, I think this is the way to tackle it. And I think people will now realize the importance. And I'll go back to my ESG example. When we talk to corporate about ESG standards and ESG reporting, a simple question will be asked is, what is the impact on bottom line? My shareholders wants that impact. And all figures, and if we look at it from a capital market perspective, stock exchange perspective, all compliant ESG standards around the world outperform any other companies that don't, and this is by numbers, on stock prices, on their even top line and bottom line. To your other question, I think we have been very lucky in this country that we have been dealing with COVID, in particular, with the support and partnership between government and private sector. But I'll take that back to Vision 2030. I have been in the private sector for over 20 years. I haven't seen the partnership between private sector and between public and private sector compared to what Vision 2030 has brought to us. Usually, in previous years, pre-Vision 2030, you see things cooked on the public sector, for example, with an isolation of the private sector opinion.
Well, it's very much like that in the Western countries.
And this is the problem. We always think about the design, we don't think about the execution side. And today, I would say, it is the only way to survive, it is the only way to go forward, is to partnership in general, whether these are from government to private or from within the private sector itself. And I think from a Tadawul perspective, this is the base we look at in developing the market. We partnership with everybody to make sure that we achieve. If we would attract foreign investors, what is the standards that foreign investors will look at from an access perspective, from an inequality perspective to that end? So, partnership is an important element to deal specifically with the challenges on this area, in my opinion.
Yeah, let me add on that. I mean, we all agree that we need partnership between the public and the private for a simple reason. If you take, for example, Africa, the IMF has estimated that over the next 5 years, we need 285 billion additional finance if we want to recover from COVID. It's impossible for the public sector to finance the whole amount. So we definitely need to be innovative and find ways to make sure that we partner with the private sector. But that being said, we've been saying that for years. You go to all the different forums, people always say we need the private sector to partner with the public sector to move forward. Now it's time to move from words to deeds. We need to make it happen. If you take, for example, Africa, we do have a lot of projects, but we lack capital. When you come to a forum like this, people say there's a lot of capital. but we're still waiting for the capital to come. I agree that we need to do reforms. We need to do reforms to improve governance. We need to do reforms to make sure that the projects are ready for the capital to be invested. That's what we try to do in Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, we do something simple. We ourselves invest in the studies of some projects. When we really think a project is really important and we think that we can actually mobilize money, we invest our own money in the research. Then we take the product and we try to sell it to investors. But we still need more financing. We put together our new development plan for 2021 to 2025. It's around $110 billion. Out of that plan, we expect a three-quarter of that amount to be financed by the private sector. That's one of the reasons why I'm in Saudi Arabia.
You can see him after the panel. Nabeel, but I want to pick up on something important that Abdou said. And I think we see the same thing in the past in Latin America, and we're going to be talking with the CEO of the SoftBank Group, Mario Clare, after this, about this very issue in Latin America. I think there's so much innovation in Africa, right? And there's so much innovation in Latin America and in the Middle East. But I think sometimes people don't really see, they look at the kind of impediments to the market without kind of finding a way to fix the market or fix, some of the problems with government in order to be able to tap into that innovation and put your capital there and help grow. I think part of the reason that Africa is not getting the capital is not because there's not a ton of innovative entrepreneurs that have amazing ideas. And I think this is one of the reasons that COVID, I think Africa did pretty well with COVID and was very resilient because of that innovation.
Yeah, I mean, when capital is chasing opportunities, it looks for stability from governments and looks in consistency of treatment over a period of time. And I think you need to have that in whatever jurisdiction you're working in. In more Western democracies, it takes a long time for legislation to come together. You kind of can see where the right.
They have the stability, but not the innovation.
Correct. And I think we're blessed here, and to bring it back to home, with a lot of innovations going on now, a lot more stability and a lot more clarity and a lot more ease of doing business than there was in the past. And now it's a lot of, frankly, capital chasing ideas. And maybe there's the dearth of ideas, but not a lack of capital within the region. Certainly I can speak about our experience here in the Middle East, or here in Saudi Arabia in particular. I think also we're talking about equality of access and equality of access to jobs. I mean, if we look at here, we have 30 or 40% Saudi ladies now here. That has been a tremendous shift in the last 3 years in terms of the workforce. We have now over 30%, 35% participation in the workforce by women. And that is an enormous shift. So here is the opportunities, I think, for investments, and opportunity for capital is already here. The legislation is mostly there. I agree 100% with Khalid. There's a lot more back and forth between the private sector and the public sector about what kind of changes are needed to enhance investments and therefore job creation. And so I think the willingness is there if the two sides can see eye to eye on things, and you have to kind of look at it together as how do we create this future for all of us to prosper. And we can't live in a moat where everyone else is fine, but I'm okay in my little castle. That's not a sustainable model in any society.
Khalid, let's talk about digital inclusion. I think the new definition of poverty, I know Princess Rima, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, says that the new definition of poverty is not really about, equity or capital. It's about that the digital haves and the digital have-nots. And so how does digital inclusion enable more equity and therefore more financial inclusion?
So in my opinion, a lack of a digital inclusion translate to financial exclusion. Because if we look at today, much of the world modern financial system is managed digitally. And the lack of digital capabilities will limit individuals, businesses from accessing broadly and deeply the system overall. And if we look at COVID-19 pandemic in specific, referring to Her Royal Highness, comments, COVID-19 just proved that digital is the new norm. who was not impacted by digital? Household, businesses, individual, organization, economies, societies, etc. So in their ways to achieve a sort of resilience and recovery out of COVID-19, whether this is in education, healthcare, or businesses. So yet digital inclusion is important, but if I look at it from a digital equity perspective, I think having access to technology is one thing, but it needs to be always complemented with the resources and education needed to access that technology, because without that education and resources or tools to access that technology, you're not taking a full advantage of such technology. And this is what I would refer of more of a digital ecosystem, because you're utilizing fully that platforms or technology. So in conclusion, in my opinion, with the increased digital capabilities today around us, it's amazing, and complementing that with the right tools and education needed to properly access such technology, in my opinion, that will ensure providing us with a full digital ecosystem access, in my opinion. But access alone, in my opinion, it's just one thing that doesn't provide the full digital inclusion.
Well, I mean, and Sharon, Khalid makes a good point, and it is true that COVID showed us, you know, people that didn't have access to broadband or, you know, digital access were left out of healthcare, left out of education for kids that were doing online schooling, ordering, all of these type of things that you couldn't physically go out and do. But he also makes a good point that if you don't know how to harness the technology, you know, maybe you'll be able to, you know, get your tele-appointment or whatever, but you really can't kind of tap into this whole new digital ecosystem that's really going to be the way the world runs.
Yeah. So, absolutely agreed, and it was a point I was going to make, you know, that the pandemic obviously accelerated the use of digital technologies, and you sort of hope that that would address inequality, but actually it exacerbated it because wealthier households and large businesses were able to take advantage of it much better. Having said that, digital technologies, I mean, it is the future, it is having massive impact, and it is, you know, reducing the cost to serve for people, which enables small businesses and rural communities to have access when they didn't have before to all of these technologies. I think fintech, financial services, have been at the spearhead of this, and digital, you know, fintech-based solutions are really making a difference and are driving significant inclusion that wasn't there before, and I think that's absolutely vital. And if you think about the fact that smartphones are replacing bricks and mortar, that apps are replacing, you know, customer service, so financial services have become much cheaper to provide, which does make that greater access. But it is also the point, do people have access to the necessary connectivity that they need? And that's where I think, you know, governments have a key role to play around providing infrastructure. But to your point, there's also education. We need, you know, basic education around digital skills. And also, when new markets are being designed, thinking about how you, I suppose, promote the attractiveness of serving the previously underserved populations and encouraging that to happen.
Margery, Sharon brings up fintech, and I mean, women are really, if you look at the field, they're really the ones that are driving this field right now, I think. And that, I think, if women are driving, shaping the technology, that's really going to shape the way society is thinking about it.
I really think it's a dual-edged thing. I think women are driving, and I think we are encouraging more women into STEM, and it's an issue not to. But I think the other side of it is that as we switch to a more technological-based society, the jobs that will be lost are also disproportionately women. So this whole idea of government and business working together to retrain people so that they have the skill set to take advantage of the technology is a really fundamental thing that will, I think, make the big difference between whether we have an equitable way of moving forward. that these women who have the opportunity, and what we've seen in the US anyway, we have this Girls That Code, I saw it's on this program too, that taking maybe women who are, or young girls who are less able to find jobs and teach them skills like coding so that they're part of the future and they have a way of lifting themselves out, I think is really a very important thing. And I just was going to mention one last thing. I think as we move to AI, and this is something that maybe people don't think about, but you know, it's important that the algorithms on which this is based also support, they're developed by men and women equally.
That's a great point.
Otherwise, the
It's a great point.
algorithms are going to further exacerbate the problem. And since most people in tech right now are men, not in Saudi has an incredible number of women graduating in engineering, putting us to shame for sure. But you know, that's something really people need to pay attention to, or we're just going to move forward in a way that doesn't.
Great point. Norm, talk about the importance of multilateral institutions.
I just want to touch upon first the democratization of technology. I'm the optimist. We've had a democratization of technology. Cell phone use in Africa. Everybody's got a cell phone. Southeast Asia. I mean, that's what you have. The challenge is, though, the challenge that Nabeel raised. You can have all this access to technology, but if there's no way to then use it, if people aren't investing in ways that the poor can then make use of telehealth, that the poor can make use of fintech, then it's wasted. And I just get back to the basics again. The basics is creating an environment. Government doesn't have its own money. Government's money comes from the people. They tax us. They tax businesses. And so in order to do that, you have to have people with wealth. And business has to prosper. And if you don't have kind of the basics, the challenge for Africa, and I served on the Africa Committee, I was chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee for a lot of time in Latin America, is the challenge of raising the level of confidence in the system, rule of law, stability, those basic things that investors, money runs scared. And if there is a fear to invest because you don't have transparency, rule of law, kind of the basic structural foundations, then all this wonderful democratization we're having is going to be of no use, because people aren't going to be able to use it because you're not going to have the resources that come from the things that we're talking about. So again, maybe it's that kind of, you know, city mayor kind of thing. If it wasn't safe, if the kids weren't educated, if we didn't have clean water, and if people didn't believe that my court system would give them a fair shake, my city would have died. Yeah. And I think it's the same with countries today.
Abdou, we've been talking about this for the last 20 minutes. You have all this, particularly in Africa, you have all this innovation, you have all this potential, and then you have all these kind of market impediments. How do you bridge that gap? And how can the international community help?
I think it's all being said. I mean, we don't have the choice. The world doesn't have the choice. We need to find a solution. Because as I said, we all interconnected. So we can't just say, you know, we stay on our corner of the world and we leave Africa alone. We have to work together. We will do our part as governments. And if you look at the different reports, things are moving in the right direction. Business climate is really improving in Africa globally. So we're doing our part. We need all to sit and find ways to make things better. So that's where the role of the private sector and the roles of multilateral development banks are quite important also, because we need to find ways to mitigate the risk. There is a bad perception of risk. Of course, there's risk. There's risk everywhere. There's no free money in the world. If you want return, you have to gamble. So we need to find ways to mitigate the risk. The risk is too high. I mean, the perception of risk is too high versus the reality. We need peace and security. I agree on that. So we have prerequisites that we need to work on. But things are moving already in the right direction. We just need to find ways together to mitigate the risk, do a bit more of blending finance, do a bit more of guarantees, and find ways to invest. But we need to invest in Africa, in all the low and middle income countries, if we want to reduce inequality.
Take it a little broader, Nabeel. We just have about a minute left. And as we close, the idea of risk, which is, when you're an investor, you have a risk of return on your investment. But we're looking at various kind of returns on investment and various types of risk, the global risk to health, peace and security, and then the monetary risk. How do you kind of bring that all together?
You know, that's why it's complex, because you have to bring it all together, and that's why I have a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me doing that. But you have to balance it all, right? You have to look at where you're investing, what sector you're investing, who you're investing with, what kind of partnerships you have. But I kind of just want to echo, I think, Norm's point that without peace, security, the basics of living, access to digitization, all that are just really bits and bytes, and not the bricks and mortar world that we all live in and we prosper in. So that aspect of all societies has to be there. That is the role of the government, that's the role of civil society, that's the role of the private sector as well. Without that basics, then all of this is just nice talk, but it really then at the end doesn't really affect how we live. And to live honorably, we all want to live honorably, we all want to have respectable jobs, we all want to have a prosperous future for our kids and our grandkids, and that only occurs in the real world. It doesn't occur in the digital world.
Can I just one suggestion that if we can end, think globally, act locally. Okay, there are ranges of organizations. I worked on for 9 years National Endowment for Democracy. We work in countries around the world to promote democracy, promote rule of law. On the ground, the folks in Guatemala, the folks in Madagascar, wherever around the world, you have those folks there. And if businesses who do a wonderful job with philanthropy, we haven't talked about, if they can be supporting some of those local efforts to work on education, to build rule of law, to do those things. I think, I'm not a big globalist. I think there's a lot going on in all these places, and if we can get our resources there, I think we can make a difference.
All right, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but that was like a really, I think, thought-provoking and solutions-driven panel on what we can do to invest in equality, not just for people and communities, but for women and girls and for societies. To my panel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
No, it's really
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Well done.
It's a pleasure.